In this video, we're going to look at PSR for autoloading with PHP. Now, if you have no idea about what PSR 4 is, or even what autoloading into your project using Composer is, don't worry, we'll have covered that by the end of the video. So the first thing to really have a look at is the PSR 4 spec on phpfig.org. So if you want, head over to this website and just check out the specification. And I'm going to be referring back to these different points throughout the video. Now, you're also going to want Composer to be installed. If you understand what Composer is and you already have it installed and you know how to use it, then that's fine. Now, once you do have Composer installed, make sure it's working by just running Composer, and you'll see a list of the commands here. That's all we really need to get going. Now, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be building up a basic directory structure for our application inside of this empty PSR4 directory. You can call this directory whatever you need. It doesn't really matter what this is called. It's what's within it that's important. And the first thing that we're going to look at is how you might typically structure your application and load in classes. Then we're going to look at how you might use the class map in Composer to load in classes. And finally, we're going to move on to PSR4 autoloading, and we're going to be namespacing our classes and setting up our directory structure so it follows PSR4 specifications. So the first thing then is to look at the traditional way you might structure your application. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with this, but let's take a look. So I'm going to create a new folder in PSR4 called app. And this is where we're going to store things like our models, maybe controllers, things like that. Now inside of here, like I just said, you might have a models directory. And we'll create an example model in here just maybe for a user. So let's say user.php. So let's define this class, and we'll make use of this in just a moment. And we will create maybe a constructor on here. And just for now, let's do a die and say hello. So inside of your directory then, let's create a new file. And this will just be where we access everything. So in index.php. Now generally what you'd do is you'd have some kind of start file or initialization file that you require in everything that you need. And that usually lives within some kind of app directory. It really varies depending on what framework you're using or how you work. So I'm going to call this start.php. So in start.php you might, for example, start sessions, connect to your database, it could be anything. But what we're going to do here is just require in our user model. So we're already within the app directory, so we just say require in models user.php. Now from any file that we work on, we can go ahead and require in our start file. So that's in app called start.php. And then we might say user equals new user. And because we have our construct on here, then you'd expect this to just show hello. So that's the basic way of doing things, but obviously this is a little bit funny because you're going to have to maybe duplicate this down or create some kind of PHP autoloader to autoload everything in. And this isn't ideal. There are better ways to do this. So the alternative solution, and really not a bad solution at all, is to utilize Composer and dump a autoload file that automatically pulls in any new classes that you create. So for example, inside of our PSR4 main directory, we're going to create a composer.json file. Now Composer is a dependency manager if you're not too sure. So we usually use this to require in, say, any dependencies we need. Say you're working with dates, you might want to pull in Carbon, which is a really popular way to manage dates. But we're not going to be looking at requiring in dependencies. We're going to be looking at specifically what we want to autoload within our project. So there are a couple of ways we can do this, but typically you might see something called a class map, and this is just an array within here of any folders that you want to automatically load in classes. So because we're outside of the app directory, all we need to do is say app models. So if you head over to your command prompt or terminal, depending on what operating system you're using, at the moment I'm within my PSR4 directory here. So all I need to do is make sure that Composer is updated first of all. This is important when we go onto the PSR4 bit, and you can just use the self-update command for this. You can see at the moment I'm already using the latest version. Then what we want to do is we want to use the dump autoload command, which will basically dump our autoloader within a vendor folder. And basically this means that we can then load in that one file, and Composer will keep track of any new files that we add to the directories that we've defined. So we say Composer dump autoload, and we pass the optimize flag as well. So you can see here it says generating optimized autoload files. If we look, we've now got this new vendor directory with a Composer folder in there, as well as any other dependencies you have in your project. And then we have this autoload file. Now don't worry about too much what this is actually doing here. Essentially, it's just loading in all of your dependencies as well as your class map. So in this case, we can substitute individually loading in different classes with just requiring in our vendor autoloader. So in here, let's add our dir and concatenate this on. We want to go back a directory because remember we're in the app folder, and we want to load in vendor autoload.php. So let's check out what this does, and there we go. So we get exactly the same result. And the same is if we wanted to add a new file in here. Let's say we wanted to add topic.php. We might have a topic class in here, again with a similar structure. I'm not going to bother filling this out. Basically what this is going to do now is when we run dump autoload again, we can go ahead and over on our index page, we can substitute this in like so, and that gives us the topic class. We obviously don't have any output here. So this is an example of how you might do things within your project, and this makes things a lot easier. Let's just get rid of this topic.php file for now. Now, when we use PSR4, we do something a little bit different inside of our JSON file. We use the PSR4 specification, both in our directory structure and how we namespace our individual classes. So what we're going to do is we're going to, in a moment, just remove our models directory and start to create out our vendor folder and then subfolders within this, ending up with our class. If this doesn't make sense, let's head over to the specification and take a look why this is. So at point 2 here, 2.2, you can see we've got a fully qualified class name has the following form. We have a namespace name. Now this is essentially your application name, your company name, or your name, anything that really defines what this project is. And then we have sub namespace names. This could be basically one or more. So, you know, it could be like repositories and then inside of that user and then something else. And we'll take a look at this in example. We are then ending with just the class name. So if this still doesn't make sense, let's go ahead and actually look at an example of what we're going to do here and how this makes sense. So let's close off all of the files that we've got open and let's sort of start kind of afresh. So I'm going to delete the models folder. Now the reason I'm deleting the models folder is because models could pretty much apply to anything, and it's kind of restricting us in a way. So the way that we do this is because we're going to be namespacing things, and if you don't know what namespacing is, that's fine, we'll cover that too, then this is going to make a lot more sense. So inside here, we're going to follow the PSR4 specification, and we're going to give it our vendor name. So remember, the PSR4 directory I have up here doesn't matter what this is called. That's not important. What matters is what we have mainly inside of our app directory. So we've now got our vendor name here. Inside of this, we would then categorize things that we need. Now, this can be anything. It would apply completely differently to different projects. So, you know, don't worry if this doesn't make sense. It can be anything. If you're working in Laravel, you might have a filters folder, or in fact, in any application. But I'm going to say repositories. So inside of here now, I'm going to create a new file, and this is actually going to be my class. So let's say we had a user repository, and I'm going to call that user repository.php, and then I'm going to go ahead and define my class. So user repository, and then we'll do the same as we did before. We'll create just a constructor here, which kills the page and just says hello. So inside of index.php, this line of code is no longer valid, so let's just remove that. But it's important to note now that we are working with a PSR4 directory structure, because we remember we have our vendor name, then we have our sub name, and then we have our class. If in repositories you wanted to create a new directory, to place this file, you could do. That would just be additional subnames. So we need to namespace this user repository in order for it to be part of the PSR4 or follow the PSR4 specification. So namespacing this means we categorize this under code course, and then you probably already guessed repositories, so repositories, and that's it. So now this user repository class is part of code course repositories. Now you might be thinking, well, why is this useful? Surely it's more code to write, etc., etc. Well, let's take a look at how we might instantiate this in our index.php file, and then we'll look at how we actually auto-load this in using PSR4 autoloading inside of our composer.json file. So inside index.php, in fact, let's go over to start.php. Remember, we've got our autoloader in here. That's important to note. So inside of our index.php file, we would do something like user equals new user repository. But obviously, we require a namespace here. So it would just be exactly the same. Code course, repositories, user repository. Now, obviously, this isn't going to work because it can't find this class. We're not auto-loading this in. So you might now be thinking, well, what's the point of putting all this here? Surely it's making more code for ourselves. It is, but we know now that it's part of a certain structure. So up here, we can say use code course repositories user repository as user repository. Now, of course, when you're importing this user repository, you don't need to be as explicit as this. I've just done it for simplicity. What you could do is remove all of this and just say you wanted to use code course repositories, in which case it would automatically know that user repositories was part of this repositories here. But we'll leave it as it is just so it makes a little bit more sense. And now this will allow us to instantiate this as part of this namespace, which keeps everything nice and tidy. It is a little bit more code, but it means that your application is going to be so much easier to manage as it scales up in size. So now we need to work out how we load things based on the namespace essentially in the directory structure. Of course, what you could do is you could say app code course, and then you could define, say, repositories, like so. Now, this would work if we just go ahead and dump the autoload again. We head over to here. It does exactly the same thing, and this is working, but we want to make this a little bit easier for ourselves. Because what happens if we create another folder inside of here, let's say filters, and then in here we have another file. We're going to have to return back to this, and we're going to have to go ahead and update this with the new structure. So we would have to say filters, for example. We don't want to do that. We want to use PSR4 autoloading in here. Let's just get rid of that filters directory. So in here what we do is we say autoload, but we define that we want PSR4 autoloading. And in here what we need to do is give the namespace, the vendor namespace. In this case we know it's code course. So I'm just going to say code course. We're going to do a double backslash here. This basically means, well, the purpose of this is because we need to escape the second backslash. That's why it's double backslash. And then we're going to provide the location to our code course directory. So that's obviously app code course. Easy. So this is all we need to do. So now what's going to happen is, because we're following the PSR4 specification, it means if we create say a new, I don't know, it could be anything, a new folder in here called filters, for example, and then we have a new file in here called, let's just pull this down, auth filter.php, and then we namespace this to code course, and you've probably already guessed, filters. That means that when we go ahead and dump this, it's automatically going to recognize the PSR4 specification here, because it's namespaced under filters, it's got the vendor name, so it's going to look inside code course, filters, and then it's going to find this auth filter class. So we can use exactly the same method for this. So let's just do a construct here, just so we can test this example out in just a moment. So let's kill this and say auth filter. Now, at the moment, when we refresh the page, we get exactly the same result. This is expected because we've made an adjustment to our composer file, but we haven't gone ahead and dumped the autoloader again. Now, when we take a look at this now, you see we still get the same result because what we've done is we've namespaced this to the specific directory structure and we're calling this user repository, and it knows that because it's PSR4 loaded that it should look for this structure. So the same with the auth filter, because we've done exactly the same thing. If we were to say duplicate this line down and we were to say filters auth filter as auth filter, we can do exactly the same thing here. Let's just get rid of this one actually. And we're going to say auth filter like so, and there we go, we get exactly the same result. So obviously this is a useless example, but it shows you how you can structure your application to first of all be more manageable, and second of all use the PSR4 standard for loading everything in. It makes everything a lot easier when you're creating larger applications. Of course, this isn't required for any application at all, but it does help when you are creating even a small application that you anticipate to be a lot larger in the future. So just to run over the specification, the fully qualified class name must have a top-level namespace. That's essentially code course that we created under here, code course, and namespaced it here. And then of course we have our sub namespace names, which is in this case filters and in this case repositories. But like I said, if you had another directory, you could just continually namespace that. Finally, we end up with the class name itself, which again is the fully qualified class name, must have a terminating class name. And there are a couple of other bits to the specifications as well, which are worth reading. So PSR4 then is improved auto-loading within applications, and we've seen an example of doing this and how helpful it can be when you are building something.